May 2nd, 1866. It's just past dawn in Memphis, Tennessee, and a black Union Army veteran named Lewis is standing in the doorway of his own home, watching a crowd of policemen and armed white civilians march down his street. Yesterday, he was a soldier who had fought to save the Union. Today, less than a year after the Civil War officially ended, he is about to become a hunted man in his own country, in a city he helped defend. By the time the sun sets on May 3rd, at least 46 black Memphians will be dead. Dozens of black women will report being raped. 91 homes will be reduced to ash. Every single black church in the city, 4 of them, will be burned to the ground, along with 8 schools where formerly enslaved children were, for the first time in their lives, learning to read. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. This didn't happen during slavery. This happened after freedom. This happened after the Union had already won. This happened while the ink on the surrender documents at Appomattox was barely a year dry. So what I want to ask you today is a simple but uncomfortable question. What happens to a country the day after it wins a war over slavery, but before it decides what freedom is actually going to mean? That's the story I'm telling you today, the Memphis Massacre of 1866. I've spent the last couple of weeks going through congressional testimony, Freedmen's Bureau reports, and the work of historians who spent their careers on this event, and I want to walk you through it the way I understand it now, not as some kind of professor lecturing you, just as a guy who got obsessed with this story and wants to bring you along for the ride. I'm going to try to give you every side of this that the historical record actually supports, because this event is more complicated and more revealing about America than most people realize. So stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why historians consider what happened in Memphis to be one of the true hinge points of American Reconstruction. Let's get into it. To understand why Memphis exploded in May of 1866, you have to understand what Memphis actually looked like in the years right before it happened. And I promise this isn't just background noise. This is the fuse that got lit. Memphis, Tennessee sits right on a bluff over the Mississippi River, and by the 1860s, it had become one of the most important cotton trading cities in the entire South. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Tennessee eventually joined the Confederacy, but Memphis itself fell to Union forces relatively early. The city was captured on June 6, 1862, after a naval battle right on the river in front of the city. From that point forward, Memphis spent the rest of the war as a Union-occupied city sitting inside a Confederate state. That's an unusual and important detail because it meant Memphis became a magnet. Once word spread that Union troops controlled the city, formerly enslaved people from the surrounding cotton plantations of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas started streaming into Memphis by the thousands, looking for protection, looking for wages, looking for freedom. This was happening all over the Union-occupied South during the war. Historians call these contraband camps, places where escaped and freed enslaved people gathered under the protection of the Union Army. And the numbers in Memphis are staggering when you actually look at them. Before the war, the city's black population was a small fraction of its roughly 22,000 residents. By 1866, that black population had exploded to somewhere over 20,000 people. The population had essentially quadrupled in just a handful of years. Most of these newly free Memphians settled in South Memphis near a Union fortification called Fort Pickering, because that fort represented safety, it represented soldiers, it represented the U.S. government's promise, however uneven that promise turned out to be, that freedom would be protected.
And here's a detail that I think is genuinely important and gets missed a lot. Some of those soldiers stationed near Fort Pickering were black themselves. Specifically, the 3rd United States Colored Heavy Artillery Regiment, black men, many of them formerly enslaved themselves, who had enlisted in the Union Army and were now stationed as armed, uniformed representatives of federal authority right there in Memphis. Try to sit with that image for a second, because it's the emotional center of this whole story. For the first time in American history, you had formerly enslaved black men walking around a southern city in Union blue, carrying rifles, answering to nobody but the United States Army. To the newly freed black population of Memphis, that was one of the most powerful symbols of the new world they were trying to build. To a huge portion of the white population of Memphis, it was an open provocation, a daily, walking reminder that the world they knew had been turned upside down. Now let's talk about who made up that white working class, because this is a piece of the story that a lot of surface-level retellings skip over, and I think it's essential to understanding what actually happened. A significant portion of Memphis's white working class was Irish immigrant, or the children of Irish immigrants. Irish immigration into Memphis had been substantial for decades. By 1850, Irish immigrants made up roughly 10% of the city's population, and that community had grown considerably in the years since. Many Irish Memphians worked as laborers, dock workers, and, critically for this story, as policemen and firemen. In fact, by the mid-1860s, Memphis's police force was overwhelmingly Irish American. Here's why that matters. The Irish immigrant community in mid-19th century America occupied a strange and often painful position in the racial hierarchy of the time. They were white by law, but they were frequently looked down upon, discriminated against, and economically marginalized by native-born white Americans. At the same time, they were now suddenly in direct economic competition with tens of thousands of newly freed black workers pouring into southern cities looking for the exact same jobs: dock work, manual labor, domestic work. Historians who've studied this conflict, notably Altina Waller in her landmark study Community, Class, and Race in the Memphis Riot of 1866, have pointed out that this wasn't simply white against black in some abstract sense. It was specifically working-class Irish Memphians who felt their already precarious economic and social position was being threatened below by a newly freed black population, all while feeling squeezed from above by native-born white elites who looked down on Irish Catholics. So you've got layered tensions here: economic competition for jobs and housing, cultural and religious friction, and now, on top of all of that, you add armed black soldiers patrolling the streets and a local white police force that resented them deeply. There was also a policy dimension that made things worse. The Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency created in March of 1865 to help formerly enslaved people transition into freedom, providing food, medical care, education, and legal assistance, had a complicated and sometimes contradictory relationship with the freed people of Memphis. Some bureau officials in the area, worried about the strain of tens of thousands of displaced people crowding into the city, actually pushed policies that pressured black Memphians, especially those labeled as vagrants, back onto plantations to sign labor contracts, essentially trying to push freed people back into agricultural labor for their former enslavers, just under wage contracts instead of chains. Black soldiers stationed in the city frequently and openly pushed back against this, telling freed people that bureau officials pressuring them to sign these contracts were lying to them. You can find letters from this period. One local Memphis minister wrote directly to the general in charge of the bureau's labor policy, protesting that black children were literally being pulled out of makeshift schools, spelling books still in hand, and told they'd be better off picking cotton. That's a direct quote from the historical record, and it tells you everything about how fragile and contested the meaning of freedom still was in Memphis in early 1866. So, by the spring of 1866, you have a city that is a genuine powder keg. You've got a massive, fast-growing free black population asserting rights it has never been allowed to have before. You've got an armed black military presence that many white residents saw as an intolerable inversion of the racial order. You've got working-class Irish immigrants who felt economically threatened and who dominated the police force. You've got a hostile local press. Newspapers like the Memphis Daily Avalanche were running stories that portrayed the growing black population as a menace to white working people and mocked federal Reconstruction efforts. And you've got a federal military presence under General George Stoneman that, frankly, had scaled back its footprint in the city because Memphis's own civilian leadership had assured Stoneman that they could keep the peace themselves. Stoneman had reduced his garrison at Fort Pickering down to roughly 150 men, primarily there to guard military supplies, not to police the city. All it would take was one spark.
The tension between black soldiers and the Irish-dominated Memphis police force wasn't new in the spring of 1866. These two groups had been colliding, sometimes literally, for months. And on April 30th, 1866, that friction produced a preview of what was coming. That afternoon, on a street called Cowsey Street, a group of black men, some accounts describe them as recently discharged soldiers, got into a physical altercation with 4 Irish policemen. It started as a fistfight, escalated to bricks being thrown, and by the time it ended a few minutes later, both sides were separating while brandishing pistols and knives at each other. Nobody died, nobody was even seriously wounded that day, but it was, in the words of historian Barrington Ryan, whose 1977 study of the riots is still cited by scholars today, an ominous foreshadowing of what was about to happen. The very next day, May 1st, 1866, which was a Tuesday, the actual spark occurred. Late in the afternoon, a white police officer attempted to arrest a black ex-soldier on the streets of South Memphis. Now, I want to be honest with you about something here, because this is a moment where the historical accounts genuinely diverge, and I think it's important to tell you that, rather than pretend there's a single clean version of events. Some contemporary accounts describe the arrest as being over a minor, almost trivial matter. Accounts vary on the specifics. What we do know is that an estimated 50 black residents, many of them former soldiers themselves, gathered at the scene and moved to prevent the officer from taking the man into custody. What happened next is genuinely disputed in the primary sources, and to this day, historians can't tell you with certainty who fired the first shot. What we do know is that a confrontation broke out between the police and the crowd, and gunfire was exchanged. In the chaos, several police officers were shot, and at least one police officer, John Stevens, was killed. Word spread through the city almost instantly, and it spread in a distorted, inflammatory form. The rumor racing through white Memphis wasn't there was a shooting altercation between police and a crowd. The rumor was that black soldiers from Fort Pickering had risen up and killed a group of policemen in cold blood, an armed black insurrection against white authority. That rumor, true or not, was gasoline. General Stoneman, trying to prevent the situation from spiraling further, ordered the black soldiers of the 3rd U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery back to Fort Pickering and had them disarmed and confined to quarters. And here's a detail I think really matters for understanding this event honestly. Those soldiers obeyed. They didn't resist. They went back to the fort as ordered and were locked inside it. From that point forward, and this is confirmed by testimony that came out in the later congressional investigation, including Stoneman's own account, the black soldiers who were supposedly the cause of the unrest were sitting disarmed inside a federal fort, while what happened over the following 2 days unfolded entirely without them. That detail matters enormously because it tells you something important about what this event actually was. It didn't stay a conflict between police and soldiers. It became something else entirely. With the black soldiers disarmed and confined, you might expect the tension to have died down that first evening. It did not. It got worse, and it shifted targets. As night fell on May 1st, 1866, Armed groups of white Memphis residents, described in multiple accounts as including police officers, firemen, and ordinary civilians, moved into the black neighborhoods of South Memphis, near where the freed people had settled around Fort Pickering. What began as a response to a specific incident involving soldiers became, within hours, indiscriminate violence against the black civilian population as a whole: men, women, children, people who had nothing whatsoever to do with the earlier shooting. Mobs went door to door, breaking into homes. They shot people in the street. They robbed residents of what little property they had. And this is where a detail that historians consider especially damning comes in. Memphis police officers and firemen, the very people whose job was to protect the public and stop exactly this kind of violence, were not merely failing to intervene. Multiple accounts, including testimony gathered later by the Freedmen's Bureau and the Congressional Committee, describe police and firemen actively participating in the violence, sometimes leading it. This wasn't simply a case of law enforcement being overwhelmed or absent. In many documented instances, the people who were supposed to be enforcing the law were the ones breaking it. One especially chilling piece of testimony that appears in multiple accounts of that night involves the local city recorder, essentially a municipal judicial officer, a man named John Creighton, who, according to witness accounts, actively incited a white crowd at the scene where the initial shooting occurred, reportedly telling the gathered men that they had the right and even the duty to go kill the last damned one of the nigger race, language that comes directly from testimony given afterward. I want to be careful here and tell you plainly, this is a paraphrase drawn from historical accounts of his remarks, not something I'm inventing for shock value. It's cited across multiple scholarly treatments of the event, including the congressional report itself. When a sitting city official is allegedly telling an armed crowd to go kill people based on their race, that tells you this was not simply a spontaneous riot that got out of hand. There was, at minimum, active encouragement from people who held positions of civic authority. By the time the sun rose on May 2nd, the violence hadn't burned itself out. If anything, it was just getting started. May 2nd, 1866 is remembered by historians as the deadliest and most destructive day of the massacre. Overnight, word of the unfolding violence had spread beyond the city limits. Armed white men from the surrounding countryside began pouring into Memphis by train, coming specifically to join the mob. White residents broke into gun stores throughout the city, stealing weapons, gunpowder, and ammunition to arm themselves and reinforce the mobs already in the streets. Accounts from the period describe much of the mob as intoxicated, moving through the black neighborhoods of South Memphis with what witnesses described as open, declared intent. Some Irish policemen reportedly swore outright that they intended to kill every black person they could find. This is the day depicted in one of the most famous images to come out of this event, an illustration that ran in Harper's Weekly titled "Scenes in Memphis, Tennessee During the Riot, Shooting Down Negroes on the Morning of May 2, 1866. If you look that image up, and I'd encourage you to, because Harper's Weekly was one of the major illustrated news publications of the era, and its Reconstruction-era coverage is a critical historical source, you'll see armed white men firing directly on unarmed black residents in the street. That's not artistic exaggeration. That illustration was made to depict, as accurately as the artists of the time could manage, events that eyewitnesses described to journalists and later to congressional investigators. Throughout the day, the mob moved systematically through the black neighborhoods near Fort Pickering. Homes were broken into, ransacked, and set on fire, sometimes with residents still inside or trying to flee. People who ran into the street to escape burning homes were shot. Freedmen's Bureau records and later congressional testimony describe robbery on a massive scale, mobs stealing money, furniture, clothing, anything of value from black households, on top of the physical violence. And this is also the day when the sexual violence documented in the official record occurred. The congressional investigation later confirmed at least 5 black women were raped during the massacre, with some historians believing the true number was almost certainly higher, given how few survivors of sexual assault in that era were willing or able to come forward and testify, especially to a room full of powerful white men. One of the women who did testify was a woman named Frances Thompson, who gave detailed testimony to the Congressional Committee about a group of men, some in police uniform, breaking into her home and assaulting her and another woman living with her. Her testimony was considered some of the most powerful and detailed evidence presented to the committee. I want to pause on Frances Thompson for a second, because her story actually connects to a really important and honestly kind of remarkable historical footnote, one that speaks to how contested the memory of this event became. A decade later, in 1876, Thompson was arrested in Memphis on unrelated charges, and during that arrest, city authorities discovered and publicized that Thompson had been assigned male at birth and had lived as a woman for years. White Memphis newspapers hostile to Reconstruction seized on this immediately, using it to try to discredit her 1866 testimony specifically, and by extension, to try to discredit the entire congressional investigation into the massacre. Modern historians, particularly Hannah Rosen, who has written extensively on gender, race, and testimony in Reconstruction-era Memphis, have examined this in real depth, and the consensus among scholars today is that Thompson's gender history doesn't actually undermine the substance of what she testified to, and that this episode says a lot more about how Reconstruction opponents were eager to seize on anything they could to discredit black testimony and federal investigations than it says about the truthfulness of the massacre itself, which is independently corroborated by dozens of other witnesses, black and white. I bring that up because I promised you I'd try to give you the full, complicated picture here, and that includes acknowledging where the historical record itself became a battleground in the years after the massacre.
Back to May 2nd itself, the destruction that day wasn't limited to homes. Mobs specifically targeted the institutions that represented black progress and black futures. Churches were burned. Schools were burned. Schools that had been established often by Northern missionary societies and teachers, specifically to educate formerly enslaved children and adults who had been legally forbidden from learning to read under slavery. White teachers and missionaries working in these black schools were themselves targeted and threatened by the mob. By the time the smoke cleared over the full 3 days, every single black church in Memphis, 4 of them, had been destroyed, along with 8 schools. If you want to understand what this event was really about at its core, I think that detail, the deliberate, systematic burning of every black church and school in the city, tells you more than almost anything else. This wasn't only about the anger of a single night. It was, at least for a significant portion of the mob, an attempt to burn down the physical and institutional infrastructure of black freedom itself, to make the message unmistakable that the old order was not going to be allowed to change without violence. The sheriff of Shelby County did attempt to organize a posse to try to restore order on May 2nd, but by most accounts it came together too late in the day and lacked the manpower to meaningfully stop what was happening. Mayor John Park, for his part, did not request state or federal military assistance during this critical second day, a decision that historians view as one of the most consequential failures of civic leadership in the entire episode. By May 3rd, the third and final day, General George Stoneman had seen enough. Stoneman later testified that he had initially been reluctant to intervene directly, partly because Memphis's civilian leadership had assured him earlier that they were capable of maintaining order without federal military involvement, and he needed a direct request from the mayor and city council to justify overriding local civilian authority with military force.
On the third day, city officials did approach Stoneman, but according to the testimony, what they asked him for was support in arming a citizen posse. Stoneman refused that request outright. Instead, he declared martial law over the city of Memphis, banned public assembly, and deployed federal troops, including, notably, both black and white soldiers, directly into the streets with orders to disperse crowds and restore order by force if necessary. That decisive move worked. By the afternoon of May 3rd, soldiers with loaded muskets and fixed bayonets had dispersed the remaining mobs, and the 3 days of violence came to an end. Stoneman later testified, notably, that in his own observation, the black population throughout the crisis had not behaved aggressively, that they were, in his words, essentially just trying to survive what was being done to them. When the violence finally stopped, the scale of what had happened became clear. Estimates vary slightly depending on the source, but the figure most widely cited by historians and confirmed by the Joint Congressional Investigation is 46 African Americans killed and 2 white men killed. And worth noting, both of those 2 white deaths appear, based on the evidence gathered, to have actually been the result of other white rioters, not black residents defending themselves. 75 or more people were reported injured. Over 100 people were robbed. At least 5 black women were confirmed raped. 91 homes were burned. 4 churches, every black church in the city, were destroyed. 4 schools were burned. Roughly $17,000 in federal property was destroyed, which in today's money would run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in the aftermath, hundreds of black Memphians were arrested and jailed, even though they were overwhelmingly the victims of the violence rather than its perpetrators. Meanwhile, almost the entire remaining free black population of the city fled Memphis in the days and weeks afterward, terrified that the violence could resume at any moment. It's worth sitting with that for a second. The massacre didn't just kill dozens of people and destroy their property. It functionally emptied a huge portion of Memphis's black community out of the city, undoing years of migration in a matter of days. Here's a question I think you're probably already asking, and it's the one that honestly makes this story sting the most. What happened to the people responsible? The answer, as much as it might frustrate you to hear it, is essentially nothing.
Despite the scale of the killing, the arson, the robbery, and the documented sexual violence, despite testimony naming specific individuals, including police officers and city officials, no one was ever criminally prosecuted for the murders, the rapes, and the arson committed during the Memphis Massacre. Not a single conviction came out of the single deadliest event of racial violence Memphis had seen up to that point. The Congressional Committee's investigation, which produced a nearly 400-page report full of verbatim witness testimony, was thorough and damning in its findings, but a congressional report is a political and historical document, not a criminal indictment. It could describe what happened and assign moral responsibility in the eyes of the nation, but it had no power to put anyone on trial or behind bars. This is one of the aspects of the Memphis Massacre that I think is genuinely important for understanding the broader arc of Reconstruction. Local law enforcement in Memphis was, per the evidence, complicit in the violence, so there was no local appetite whatsoever for prosecuting the police and citizens involved. State authorities in Tennessee, only a year removed from the Confederacy, showed little more urgency, and the federal government, while it investigated thoroughly and used the massacre for enormous political effect at the national level, which we're about to get into, did not have at that point in 1866 the legal or military infrastructure in place to pursue federal prosecutions of local civilians and officials for what amounted to a mass civil rights atrocity. That infrastructure, federal civil rights enforcement, military districts, the ability of federal courts to intervene in cases like this, was, in a very real sense, built afterward, partly because of what happened in Memphis.
Now, here's where the Memphis Massacre becomes, in my opinion, one of the genuinely pivotal moments of 19th century American history, because even though nobody went to prison for it, the massacre changed the direction of the entire country. To understand why, you need a little bit of political context about where America stood in the spring and summer of 1866. President Andrew Johnson, who had taken office after Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, was pursuing a version of Reconstruction that was, relatively speaking, lenient toward the former Confederate states and did not prioritize aggressive federal protection of the rights of the formerly enslaved. Johnson's approach put him increasingly at odds with a bloc in Congress known as the Radical Republicans, who believed that Reconstruction needed to be far more assertive, that the federal government needed to actively guarantee civil rights and protection to freed people in the South, by force if necessary, because the Southern state governments clearly weren't going to do it on their own. The Memphis Massacre landed right in the middle of this political fight, and it landed hard. News of the massacre, especially once the Congressional Committee's detailed report came out, spread across the North and generated enormous sympathy and outrage. It gave the radical Republicans exactly the kind of concrete, undeniable evidence they needed to argue their case. Look, they could say, this is what happens when the federal government steps back. This is what self-government in the South actually looks like for Black Americans right now. Newspapers across the North covered it extensively, and it became a rallying point in the broader political argument over how Reconstruction should proceed. And the timing here is remarkably tight, historically speaking. Just weeks after the Memphis Massacre, on June 16, 1966, Congress formally passed and submitted to the states for ratification the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, the amendment that, among other things, established that anyone born in the United States is a citizen and that no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny anyone the equal protection of the laws. That amendment would ultimately be ratified on July 9, 1868. Now, I want to be careful and precise here because I don't want to overstate the case. The drafting and political groundwork for the 14th Amendment had already been underway before the Memphis Massacre happened. This wasn't an amendment written from scratch in direct response to 3 days of violence in Tennessee. But historians are in strong agreement that the Memphis Massacre and the New Orleans Massacre that followed it just a couple of months later in July 1866 provided crucial real-world momentum and public urgency that helped push the amendment through Congress and helped build the broader public and political case for the more aggressive, radical phase of Reconstruction that followed, including the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the former Confederacy into military districts and placed them under direct federal military oversight, specifically to protect the rights of freed people.
Our understanding of the Memphis Massacre comes primarily from two overlapping investigations. The first was conducted by the Freedmen's Bureau, which, remember, this was the federal agency established in March 1865 specifically to assist formerly enslaved people, dispatched Colonel Charles Johnson, the Bureau's Inspector General for Kentucky and Tennessee, along with other officers, to investigate almost immediately. Their report described in detail the bitterness that had existed for months between the Black community and what the report itself, using the language of the time, called the low whites of the city, meaning essentially working-class white residents with whom freed people were in direct daily competition and conflict. The second and more famous investigation was conducted by a joint congressional committee, which arrived in Memphis on May 22, 1866, just 3 weeks after the violence ended, and interviewed roughly 170 witnesses, black and white, including Francis Thompson, whom I mentioned earlier, and General Stoneman himself, whose testimony opens the final report.
That committee produced a nearly 400-page report dated July 25, 1866, filled with verbatim sworn testimony, which remains the single most important primary source historians rely on to this day. If you're the kind of person who wants to go read primary sources yourself, that congressional report is publicly available, and I genuinely encourage you to look into it, because there is something powerful about reading the actual words of people like Jane Sneed, a woman who had come to Memphis in 1862 seeking freedom during the war, and who in May of 1866 was living near Fort Pickering with her husband and 14-year-old daughter, Rachel, when the mob came through her neighborhood, describing in her own words what she saw and survived. These sources are why historians today are able to speak with real confidence about what happened during those 3 days, even 160 years later. This wasn't a case of history being reconstructed generations later from scraps and rumors. It was documented almost immediately, exhaustively, and under oath by federal investigators who arrived in Memphis within days and weeks of the violence itself. So how is the Memphis Massacre remembered today, and why does it matter that you know about it now, in the present? For a long time, honestly, it wasn't remembered much at all, at least not publicly, not with the kind of civic recognition an event of this scale deserves. It took roughly a century and a half for Memphis to formally and publicly reckon with what happened in its own streets in May of 1866. In May of 2016, on the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the massacre, the University of Memphis hosted what was described as the first ever public academic symposium specifically examining the massacre, bringing together historians to discuss slavery, emancipation, and Reconstruction in light of this event. That same period saw increased public commemoration efforts, including historical markers placed in the city.
One detail I find genuinely striking, and I want to leave you with it. One of the historical markers commemorating the Memphis Massacre today stands just a block south and east of the site where, on April 4, 1968, that's 102 years, almost to the day of a full century after the massacre, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated at what is now the site of the National Civil Rights Museum. I don't think that's a coincidence historians would want you to read too much mystical significance into, but I do think it's a genuinely powerful geographic and historical echo, two of the most significant acts of racial violence in the long, unfinished story of Black freedom in America, separated by roughly a century, standing within walking distance of each other in the same city. The scholar whose work underpins much of our modern understanding of this event, the late historian Stephen V. Ash, wrote what's now considered the definitive book-length study titled A Massacre in Memphis, the Race Riot That Shook the Nation 1 year after the Civil War, published in 2013. If this video has gotten you interested in going deeper, that book is really the place I'd point you to next. So let me try to bring this all together for you. The Memphis Massacre of 1866 sits at this incredibly fragile, incredibly important hinge point in American history, the exact moment when the country had to decide what freedom was actually going to mean in practice, not just on paper. The 13th Amendment had already abolished slavery by the time this happened, ratified back in December of 1865. Slavery as a legal institution was over. But what this event shows you in the most brutal and undeniable way possible is that ending slavery and establishing actual freedom, real, protected, equal citizenship, were two very different things, and the gap between them was going to be filled with violence, political struggle, and ultimately constitutional change, one bloody event at a time. 46 people were killed over 3 days in a city they had come to specifically because they believed it represented safety and a new life.
Their homes, their churches, and their children's schools were burned to the ground. And in the aftermath, not one person was ever held criminally accountable. But their deaths and the testimony survivors like Jane Sneed and Francis Thompson gave under oath just weeks later became part of the evidence that helped push a reluctant nation toward the 14th Amendment and a more assertive vision of Reconstruction, even if that vision itself, tragically, would be worn down and rolled back over the following decades. I think stories like this deserve to be known, not because they're easy to sit with, because they're really not, but because understanding them honestly, with all their complexity and all their competing perspectives, is genuinely how you understand how America got to where it is. If you learned something from this today, that's really all I set out to do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.